This from what school, Bill?
University of Alberta.
Thank you, Bill. Bill is an accomplished national and global executive who has worked in the highest levels of business, law, and government. He has a track record of leading transformational change, developing organizations, leading people to realize their potential, fostering internal and external partnerships and collaboration, and delivering results. He has spent more than 10 years working on integrated health solutions in Canada and around the world in the rapidly changing global pharmaceutical industry. Bill was most recently the Chief Health Innovation Strategist for the province of Ontario. Prior to that, Bill worked in the United Kingdom with AstraZeneca, one of the world's largest innovative pharmaceutical companies. His work across the Canadian healthcare system has included building collaborative approaches to adopting innovative value-adding technologies across a variety of fields of study. Bill, welcome. Our second panelist is Jason Ding. Jason, do you have a BCom from the University of Alberta?
I do.
This is a setup, by the way.
Jason is a chartered professional accountant and chartered business valuator with a particular expertise in life sciences and healthcare, software, energy services, and manufacturing industries. He has worked with companies at the startup stage, large national and international public companies, and public sector clients in a variety of sectors. For over 10 years, Jason has focused on transactions in the area of licensing, partnering and alliances, mergers and acquisition, equity and debt financing, business valuations, corporate finance, and general financial advisory service lines. Jason is a member of the first Health Studies Standing Committee with a focus on specific goals and needs in our health ecosystem. Prior to working in the financial industry, Jason worked as a science reporter for CBC Radio, I didn't know that, an ombudsman for the University of Alberta, and in a variety of research labs. Jason, welcome. And because we had a quota of 2 Jasons on our panel, I'm happy to welcome Jason Pinnock. Jason is the CEO of DynaLIFE Medical Labs, one of Alberta's largest private healthcare organizations. At over 1,100 employees, DynaLIFE is Canada's most regarded multidisciplinary clinical laboratory organization and is recognized as one of Canada's best managed companies. DynaLIFE is internationally accredited for quality and provides clinical diagnostics to support physicians, patients, hospitals, and other healthcare providers from central Alberta through the territories. With a decade of experience in the executive level, his background includes roles such as Chief Operating Officer, Chief Financial Officer, and Business Development Government Relations. Although his professional background is financial, he's regarded for his transparent and accountable leadership style as a creator and driver of innovation and strategy, and a trusted and supportive partner to both government and industry. Jason is currently the board chair of Health City and provides leadership and strategic oversight to the organization. Jason, welcome. So what I've asked our panelists to do is to set the stage, and we're going to go first to Bill and then Jason Ding and finally Jason Pinnock, set the stage with some of their experiences and overviews on this topic and issue of healthcare and delivery and innovation and how it can be seen and used to help grow our economy. Bill, let's start with you.
So first of all, thanks very much, Joe. I've spoken to a couple of people. I really am a proud alum of the University of Alberta, and I love that Joe's found reasons kind of every couple of years to have me come back. I have family here, and I really miss the place, I really do. Notwithstanding the temperature, I mean, it's spectacular outside. It is crystal blue sky, it's crisp. Generally, these are 2 things that don't ever happen in the city of Toronto. The other thing I chuckled about is, so I grew up in Lethbridge, as I said, went to U of A, and when I was at AstraZeneca, I did a lot of work in Edmonton, including I was being on the board of IHE, and John Sproul reminded me that for a number of years, I was chair of the Audit and Finance Committee. I am a lawyer, do not do what you do, for example. I should not have been the chair of the Audit and Finance Committee. Anyway, nothing bad happened, don't worry. Your publicly funded, or your public monies are in good hands. So I think I'm here to, well, I know I'm here to bring a bit of a national and even international perspective on the following topic. So if you take nothing else from the next 5 minutes, take away this. Health is an economic driver. Health is an economic driver. Everybody say it with no. So I spent my past 3 years and a bit were as Ontario's first Chief Health Innovation Strategist. The mandate was, the first time the government in Canada said it's time to leverage the massive state investment in healthcare as an economic driver. Get away from the notion that it's just a line item that we talk about only around budget time, like is it too much, too little, and everyone gets wound up about either one of those depending on their perspectives. It is half of the Fortune 50 companies, probably half of the Fortune 20 companies are now in healthcare. And it's not just McKesson and Pfizer, it's Apple, Google, Microsoft, Amazon. You've seen these announcements come out. It's Ford trying to figure out how the autonomous vehicle can be used in different ways. It is arguably the fastest and largest growing job and wealth creator as an industrial sector in the 21st century. And we can have a whole debate about why Canada's never seen it that way. We just need to move past that. And Alberta's done that. Justin Reimer and I were kind of tag teaming in different countries and jurisdictions talking about this point. And he's now heading up innovation partnerships at AHS. So Alberta was there. Quebec has now created an office modeled online. So we're figuring this out. The feds are a little more versatile, or a little more fluent in this. But that is the number one message to take away. Because if we all agree, whether we're in public sector or private sector or mixed, that health is an economic driver, we can then focus on executing that vision or strategy, however you want to articulate it. When our purpose in Ontario in our office was to drive collaboration across the system. So remember that collaboration word. To accelerate the adoption and diffusion, so diffusion, spread, second really important word, of new innovative health technologies and processes. There's another one. It's not just tech, it's processes, it's way of doing things. With 3 objectives: improve patient outcomes. So again, it is not a zero-sum game between improving patient outcomes and adopting and scaling innovation. In fact, one flows with the other. So our objectives are to improve patient outcomes, optimize the investment in health innovation. Again, just because it's a bright, shiny bauble doesn't mean it's the right thing for the health system. You got to optimize the investment in this stuff and create jobs in the province. And it's interesting, I'm now helping the EU's health tech organization, including by spending the last week in Munich, evaluating proposals for funding from them, from European countries, and they're having exactly the same conversation. And the concern in Ontario, and I think it is here, it certainly is in Europe, is we have no problem, we're just talking about the University of Alberta, we have no problem with ideation, we have no problem with startups, we have no problem with research. What our biggest challenge and therefore opportunity is to scale up these companies and keep them in Ontario or Alberta. And by the way, it's exactly the same conversation in Europe, which is really surprising to me. These companies, there's a dearth of funding. They get to a point where either a Series A or a subsequent series comes in from the Valley or Texas or somewhere, and the pressure is to leave our provinces. And as I said, same thing in Europe. So that's the challenge and that's the opportunity. I'll leave you with a couple of thoughts and then hand it over to Jason's. So what did we learn? What worked? What didn't work? Again, we could do hours on this stuff, but here's just a couple things as you're thinking through this. And again, Justin could do this at least as eloquently, if not more so than I am. Couple things. It's an ecosystem. So we talked about that at our table. It is an ecosystem. Nobody's going to do this on their own. We can't rely on the government to do it. You have a huge advantage in having the AHS and the SCNs. We always looked wistfully at this from Ontario's highly fragmented system of chaos. So that's an opportunity, but it's not going to be just the AHS. It's not going to be the government. It's not just going to be private citizens. You need the ecosystem, and you're well on the way to that. Physician leadership. So we can't get through a whole discussion on this without appreciating how important it is that there's physician leadership at the helm of this. And Ontario has a terrible relationship with its doctors right now, but individually, physicians were our biggest champions. My understanding is you got a much better relationship here, but don't forget that, right? If you talk to Cleveland Clinic or somebody who does strategic supply chain management really well, that's their number one lesson, physician leadership. Thirdly, focus on the priorities in 2 senses. One, anyone doing this kind of work who wants to have impact, That was our mantra, judge us on the impact we have, not how many speeches I give or meetings we host. You need to have fewer priorities rather than more. That adage of if everything's a priority, nothing is so true in health, and especially in this file. You could have a list of potential priorities as long as we're tall, but you need to focus on a couple and really seek to make the difference. So for Ontario, we really dug in on the shift to value-based procurement, and we really dug in on optimizing the pathways to the adoption and scaling of innovation. How do we replicate the competition that means that in the private sector you adopt, because if you don't, you'll die. So we need to figure out a way to get that in publicly funded systems. And then the last thing I would say is, the second part of the priority side is help the system and press the system to identify what's really important to it. Every meeting we had with companies, we would say, just because it's cool to your family and friends, it's a bright, shiny bauble, does not mean it's actually going to be adopted in the system. Why? Because as we said, the priorities that the system will identify are huge, but get them to really articulate, the list of unmet needs for the system is huge, but get them to really articulate the priorities in those unmet needs. Like if it's long-term care, it's probably, in Alberta as in Ontario, medication management and reducing harmful falls. Okay, so if you're developing the product, target that. But the system has to articulate what's important to it and therefore what it will fund. And I'll probably stop there because I think those are probably common in your jurisdictions. We can talk about other things if questions.
Bill, thank you very much. Really, really insightful. We'll come back to some of those once we've gone through the other panels. Jason.
And that's a perfect segue actually into what I wanted to talk a bit about, which is talking about the ecosystem, sort of where we're at in Alberta. And to give you, for those of you that aren't sort of deep in the ecosystem on the innovation side, a bit of a flavor on some of the things that have happened over the last few years that have really advanced, I think, the innovation sort of, we'll call it commercialization and scale, and some of the efforts that actually the system had and really created in terms of opportunities to try to communicate, where some of the challenges are and where some of the needs are in terms of where the problems are that need to be solved. Just to back up as well, the only other thing I wanted to add is that I spent some time actually in the innovation system with Tech Edmonton for about 5 years. Working in the health space, working with spin-off companies, and so I have that lens a little bit as well with respect to what I'm seeing. Priority-wise, globally, I just came back from the JP Morgan Healthcare Conference. It's the largest financing conference in the world, held in San Francisco every year. Where innovations are happening right now, primarily, and where we're seeing money go, CRISPR and genetic technologies are a major facet of where people are really interested in. There's some very interesting technologies around where genetic engineering and genetic editing is going to be able to make a difference for genetic diseases, which is a big challenge. We're seeing a big difference as well in cancer. Still a very, very hot area. Pretty much from a venture capital perspective, you've got an early stage cancer company and technology, money's going there. And then the other thing I'd say is diagnostics and personalized medicine, and that's a big area right now. We're seeing lots of companies within Alberta in that space as well. And so if I think about the companies that are in Alberta and the number of companies that are in each of those spaces, we're set. I mean, from an ideation perspective, our ability to generate research and create solutions in that space, we've done a fantastic job. The question is, how do we take those solutions then? How do we commercialize them and really drive that into the industry? So in terms of talking about Alberta and where I've seen Alberta go over the last several years. So we used to talk about Alberta being a flyover zone. So people would basically go from Ontario, they would fly over to Vancouver, they would look at certain technologies in that space and then fly back over. That's not the case anymore. So certainly over the last 5 years, we have regular visits from scouts, and there's programming actually available for researchers, for companies to meet with pharmaceutical companies, to meet with med device companies, and really look at getting the word out about the technologies that we have here, the companies that we have here, and articulating that value proposition to industry, which is a key partner, of course, in this space. Another area I'd also say is within the innovation system, incubators and accelerators have really been making an impact. Tech, of course, has a health accelerator program. Merck Invents, so Merck, very large global pharmaceutical company, for those of you who don't know, has a lab partnership set up here in Edmonton, where they basically select companies that they're going to support and mentor through that process. JLabs also has a presence here through their JLabs Pods process. DynaLIFE has a partnership here as well to really take some of that industry knowledge and mentor these companies forward in terms of what it is that they're looking to do. One of the other common, I would say, complaints that we heard within the ecosystem that I think has changed over the last few years is that AHS, in terms of adopting technologies, has not done a good job. That companies will approach AHS and say, look, we'd like you to be our first customer. We're flying overseas. We're getting asked, so how much of this product have you sold in Canada, in Alberta? And often the answer was zero. But again, massive changes, I think, I'd say massive, but incremental changes have happened in that space as well. So Exciton, a wound care company in Edmonton, their products are getting acquired by AHS or purchased by AHS. Surface Medical, a company in Calgary, has their products now being purchased by AHS. And then a couple of weeks ago, just learned that Orpix, which is a diabetes company, basically a sensor in the shoe that helps with sensors and diagnostics. Their product is now being reimbursed through the AADL program, which is Alberta Aids for Daily Living. So there's basically a reimbursement process for patients who need that product now being purchased through the system. So those are huge changes, and through conversations with the SCNs, conversations with the system, those changes have been advanced. So we've seen a tremendous uplift, I think, within the system, and we just need to keep doing it. We need to keep pushing the ecosystem and pushing companies to think bigger, think globally, and to be able to drive revenue for their products and not just grant funding and not just equity financing. We really need to drive revenue.
Jason, thank you. Jason Pinnock.
Well, the challenge with going third is that everyone else steals your content, so not going to fly. So maybe what I'll do is, we heard some interesting comments. Number one is it's an international race. This is not unique to us. This is not unique to Alberta. We are playing in a very big game where, interestingly enough, when it comes to healthcare, the standards are, for the most part, international standards, which means anyone who builds it in their own jurisdiction can sell it anywhere in the world. So it is very much a world race for health innovation. So that's a really interesting one. We heard that. Number two is other people are jealous of what we have. What that converts to me is we have no excuse. To be frank, and I'm putting words in your mouth, but we already have what other people desire. And so, it really comes then down to it's a world race. We have great assets. For those of you who really want to articulate those assets, where else in North America can you go to access a population of 4.5 million people that's genetically diverse, that's geographically isolated in its own incubator, well, maybe its own freezer, where you have single jurisdictional authority, where you can sit at a table with maybe 4 people around that table to look at exploring anything from something in remote nursing care all the way to extended care facilities to major acute care environments and surgical facilities. That does not exist in other jurisdictions. Other jurisdictions have multi-players, multi-regional models. They have multi-insurer environments that will not share information between each other. We have massive assets in this province. Unfortunately, we have come up with great excuses not to lead with them. And that's where it comes down to execution. We are past, I think, the visioning stage in Edmonton around where we need to be, and we are in the execution stage of where we need to be. And for those of you who are in the public system and are sitting there going, well, we're talking a lot about economic development and commercial entities and startup companies. What does that mean if I'm a healthcare provider, in a mainstream healthcare public facility? It's important to understand that the difference between commercialization and clinical adoption really is simply the jurisdiction you happen to be in, right? It's just whether that happens to be funded out of a public system or it's funded out of a private system that's making the decision about whether moving forward. But the path to getting something commercialized or getting something clinically adopted is almost identically the same path. You need the same kind of clearances, whether it's FDA or Health Canada, whether you want to introduce it in clinical practice or you want to sell it, it's basically the same process. Which means that we need to get much, much better at adopting things into clinical practice, because by adopting them into clinical practice, we are also taking the exact same path to validate them at a commercial level anywhere in the world. Because one of the benefits in Canada is we happen to operate at a fairly high world standard for what we believe healthcare delivery should be. So in theory, if it can be delivered here and adopted clinically here, it can also be delivered almost anywhere else in the world and adopted there. And so often we think of the commercialization as something that's outside of our public health system. It's not at all. It's actually the key to creating a sustainable health system. Because ultimately, innovation is just really another word for change. And change is just courage. Change is just trying new things. Change is just finding ways to say yes instead of finding ways to say no. And really, that's where the execution comes in our jurisdiction. And I give credit to Justin's names come up, Mark Leduc, who really led that from the inside at the beginning when Justin was at Health. But we need to rethink AHS instead of as a procurer of technology, as a development partner in technology. It is our biggest development platform. It is a phenomenal asset in this province, but we need to think about them in the development tent rather than as someone we ultimately might sell to. To do a pilot to make that real, Jason mentioned the diagnostic accelerator that we created at DynaLIFE, and it came out of a very simple question, which was how could we really help SMEs compete in a way that would be very difficult for someone else to replicate, and it was something unique to us. And what we decided to do is we actually hollowed out the middle of our sort of hub lab in the center of downtown Edmonton here, and we created suites, and then we invited SMEs to come and actually work in the suites alongside our staff to develop their diagnostic technologies to the next step. And it's been incredibly successful. So one of those players was Nanostics, who won the Falling Walls competition at the U of A, went on to win the Falling Walls for Canada, and then presented in Berlin on behalf of Canada for innovation. And they were only able to do that because we could, by embedding them in our actual, instead of treating them from the outside, come pitch to me and I'll decide if I'm going to buy, we instead said, you have something really interesting. We think if we partner with you, we can develop it faster, more targeted, more focused, and more realistic for delivery in the real world if we actually embed you in our space and invite our staff to help you solve your problems. And very rewarding for our staff. And we're not taking IP or equity stakes or anything like that. It's not a commercial thing. It's about a proof of concept that we can do it here. And we can do it and we can leverage this platform in a way that other jurisdictions structurally are not designed to do. And the evidence out of the first companies we filled up within, I think, 10 months we were full. I came back to Justin and said, I'm full, like where else can we take this? And so we started looking at how could we scale that model provincially and actually open up other areas to what has now become, are we calling it the TRL or the TRP? I forget. The TRP, the Translational Research Program, which is really about how do we embed these organizations in the real world, in the actual clinical environments, and work with them to finish their product. So this is about screening the great ideas, picking the winners, and helping them accelerate across the finish line. That is something we can do. Right? We may not have 5,000 of these companies like they do in the Bay Area, but if we've got 500, we can make sure that the probability of those 500 winning and getting to market is significantly better than any other jurisdiction. Another big area we need to execute on is our data. This room, all of us have to get comfortable that our data is an asset. And that, we are all huge proponents of personal privacy, but collectively, our data has the ability to move healthcare forward in a way that's very difficult, again, to replicate in other jurisdictions. We have a consolidated health record that is really almost second to none. But we need to be able to leverage that. We need to find opportunities to allow access to that in a safe way. And we need to do that for the benefit of Edmonton and for the benefit of Alberta, which means we need to not, J&J and other players, we're not going to give our data set away, right? We are not going to ship it to somewhere else in the world. You want to come play, then you come play here. And that goes back to sort of the other challenge, which is talent. How do we build scaling talent? The challenge we have is we have a hard time being able to answer the question of how many companies in Alberta have been successfully launching healthcare products in the last few years. And if I challenge everyone to name a couple names, There's probably not very many people here who would get more than 10. But then if I ask the question, how many companies have launched a second product out of Alberta, that number drops significantly. If we want economic development, we want economic benefit, it comes with jobs. It comes with building talent and expertise. And you only get there when you scale, when you're on your second product, when you're on your third product. And then you have spin-off companies that come out of those companies with new ideas. It's about critical mass. It's not good enough to just get, we have the equivalent of the farmer's market in healthcare. Lots of great little stalls with 2 or 3 people in them with great ideas, but not at scale, right? We still go buy our groceries from Sobeys and Save-On, right? We need to get our organizations to scale, right? We need to get out of this farmer's market mentality, and we need to think about how do we develop in Alberta, how do we use this platform, because if we can make it big enough to serve 4.5 million people, we can make it big enough to serve anyone in the world. And it is no longer about developing products that we might procure in Alberta. It is about co-developing products with our SMEs that we will sell to the rest of the world. And so there's no mystery to the vision. There's no magic to the platform. We know what assets we have. The answer is now in execution. And those of you who probably heard me on Friday got the lecture about no one is going to do this for us. We are in a competitive world. We are way too small to speak with any more than one voice. And so we need to figure it out. And as you heard, other people are jealous of what we have, but we will be left behind if we fail to execute. And so that really is my call to action. It is something that impacts everyone in this room. You all have the opportunity to play. We need to democratize change in this system. We need to make it acceptable that right at the bench level or right at the nursing bed, that we have the ability to innovate and change and try these new things and make that a safe environment. We did it for quality. Everyone who participates in quality initiatives that allow us, it is a safe place to play. You don't have to worry about, we created Section 9 legislation. We did all kinds of things to make improving quality a safe place. We need to do the same thing for innovation. We need to de-risk innovation and give us all the ability to execute on that. Sorry, there goes my rant from the third stool.
That was great, and I'm struck by the level of optimism that I hear. You're all incredibly optimistic. So before going down that path, let me maybe just ask you in turn, why are we not further down that path? Bill, starting with you, if all the conditions are aligned, there's lots of smart people, there's AHS, there's a lot of opportunity. Why are we not further down that path, and why is Alberta or Canada not better positioned in terms of this global competitive environment?
Yeah, so here I'll have to use the discipline to keep it short. Okay, so I can be as controversial as I want, right? So just so you know, my political leanings are central. Okay? So I'm not on one end, I'm not on the other. Here's the thing. Somehow do you remember when CBC did the poll for, did that thing and they had an intelligence show about the greatest Canadian of all time, and you know who was first? Tommy Douglas, because of the creation of the publicly funded health system. Okay, got that, right? What makes you a Canadian? Someone will say when you're traveling somewhere else in the world. And honestly, one of the first things that we'll say is we're not an American, and then we pause for laughter. But we define ourselves negatively except for a couple of things. And the first one that seems to always come up is the publicly funded healthcare system. So this mythology has just been a block to kind of what I said at the very beginning, thinking about this as an industry. So while we're navel gazing, I'm going to give you an example out of Ontario in a second that's in the front on the front page of papers. Well, we're navel gazing about how to protect this publicly funded system, which, by the way, is not single tiered and is not 100% public. In Ontario, only 7% of health is publicly funded. And Andre Picard had a great piece in the Globe and Mail, I think yesterday or the day before, and he said, well, wait a second. Somewhere 50 years ago, somebody decided that everything done in a hospital or by a doctor was so important that it was going to be publicly funded. But your eyes, your teeth, your physiotherapy kind of didn't exist. Nutrition, well, none of that stuff got publicly funded. Well, we don't live in the world that was 50 years ago. So just the fundamental underpinnings of what we say is a single-tier publicly funded system aren't applicable anymore in the same way they were before. So I'll stop. But I'll just say that because we have this mythology on the publicly funded system, any conversation that involved using it as an economic driver would be at least controversial and sometimes stopped. So one of the reasons I love taking this job, and some of you in the room have heard me say this before, when I took the job as Ontario Chief Health Innovation Strategist, using health as an economic driver, is because 14 years ago, the head of Medtronic Canada, me, other people in pharma and device and university and academia wanted to leverage the economic spend, the health spend as an economic driver. 14 years ago, and honest to goodness, conversations would be stopped by people from the ministries of health across the province, across the country, saying, you're talking about private delivery of healthcare, which we're not talking about. We're just not. You can have that conversation over here. We're talking about the kinds of things that in particular Jason was saying, like have the health authority as a co-developer. It's not zero sum, improve patient outcomes or create jobs in the province using health. So I think that's the big experience. The second one, which I won't go into detail on, and I think is as important, is, and related to the first, is it was described to me that the biggest barrier to the adoption scale of health innovation in our province, and I would say in the country, is risk aversion. And you realize it's not actually risk aversion, it's a desire for zero risk. Almost literally so in many cases, right? And it sounds goofy to say this, but of course, in your personal life, I wouldn't have flown out here from Toronto if that was the marker. I wouldn't have, walked in the snow and minus 35 temperature. Like, we just wouldn't. That's not how we conduct our lives. Certainly not the way you conduct business. And by the way, not the way you do good public policy. But in health, we seem to get there. And I think it's actually more fundamental than this. And now I'm not in the job, so I'll use the words that I wanted to use at the beginning. There's a big capability gap. So I don't know if it's the case in Alberta, but in Ontario, you're talking about a $60 billion business, so a $22 billion business here in a turnaround situation. Don't know if that's the case here, but in Ontario it is. And around the executive table of the Ministry of Health, you had one person in private sector business experience, me, and one physician, the Deputy Minister, Bob Bell, used to run UHM Health Network. By the way, neither one of us are there anymore. So if you look up and down and across the system, you're asking people to turn around a business, the hardest thing you can do maybe outside of being a startup, and they don't have the capabilities to do that. And it's 2019. We know that the optimal outcomes in any organization's work comes from the application execution of the best of the private sector and public sector. This is not black and white anymore. And so in health, we need to get to the place where we've got a strategy, say health is an economic driver, however you articulate it, a structure that facilitates it, and the capabilities in the people that act, organizational capabilities in the people that allow you to do the kinds of things that you need to do, and then the processes will support it. So I think it's those two things. It's getting past this mythology that you can't have health as an economic driver, and that we need to have a better organizational capability set.
Great. Jason?
Yeah, I'll take a little bit more of a small company sort of corporate industry view on that same question, but it actually comes back to the same thing you talked about earlier, which is risk. So from a risk perspective, this is a challenging industry, right? So from a regulatory perspective, it takes a really, really long time, and it takes a lot of money in order to get a product from beginning to end. So on average, on a therapeutic, for a therapeutics company that's developing a new drug for whatever, it's over $1 billion required in order to get that product from beginning to end. You have clinical trial requirements that you need to meet. You've got to be able to prove out the safety and the efficacy of the product. That amount of money is just not readily available if you're a startup company spun out of the university trying to drive commercialization efforts in that space. In the end, at some point, you're going to have to partner. And so that last sort of phase 3 trial costing $500 million is going to require someone with a lot of capital that you're probably not even going to be able to get from the public markets. So you're going to need a large pharmaceutical company basically willing to come in and say, look, I've looked at your phase 2 results, they look great. I'm gonna take a risk on your phase 3 trial. Let's partner. And by the way, we've got reps, regulatory people in every country with different regulatory regimes, supply chain management all over the world. We have our systems in place. It makes no sense for you, a 10-person company to go and try to commercialize that globally yourself. But to Jason's point, the next step after that should be to try to do it again with product 2, right? So you take the profits from product one, hopefully you're willing to jump back in and do it all over again. The challenge has been that it's so much risk often that people just want to do it once. Like we took this risk, we've raised all of this money, we were successful once, we don't necessarily want to do it again. And so you have to, we have to change some of that mindset. I also see within the tech field that the mindset is, how do we exit as quickly as possible so we can create the next company and not necessarily scale. And so there's a lot of consolidation happening in the space right now. We're not seeing a lot of very large new entrants into the space. If you look at the medical device industry right now, lots of consolidation. The number of exit opportunities for med device companies is very limited. Mega deals are still happening within the pharma space. In January, BMS, Bristol Myers Squibb, just announced they're buying Celgene for over $70 billion, which is a massive deal. And so we're seeing fewer and fewer exit opportunities within that space as well, which is also, and maybe this is the last point, why we're seeing some shift as well in terms of gains that can be made within med device, within AI, within health tech, because they are a little faster to market, a little less risky from a commercialization standpoint, and so people are starting to gravitate there. And cannabis. So that would be, I think, within Canada, a big area which is actually, creating a bit of a sucking sound out of pharma. We're seeing companies who are looking at, new opportunities in cannabis, taking, lessons learned within the pharmaceutical sector and technologies within the pharmaceutical sector and starting to apply them within the cannabis field. And so that's actually, creating a massive economy on that end, but taking some talent actually away from this.
Jason, before we go to you, just asking the audience to think about questions that you might have, because after Jason Pinnock gives us his thoughts on this question, we're going to have a mic going around inviting you to ask questions. Jason.
I would just add one thing, and maybe I'll let you guys all think about your own environments, and you can decide where you score on this scale. But I think practically we made a choice. I'm not sure it was the best choice, and I'll explain why. How many of us in the room would view our operation as best practice? Well, no hands. Okay, that's kind of scary, but
it's an honest audience.
Yeah, but for a long time in Canada, we looked at our health system when if you think about the spectrum, you can lag behind technology, you can keep up, you can be current, right? You can drive the current version of the car, you can drive the last year of the last Ford Taurus, and they've worked out every bug. There's absolutely no risk, but your car was designed 10 years ago, right? You can be that. You can be, I would say middle of the pack. You can be best practice, and best practice is where we decided to be. But best practice just means you're a follower, because if you look around the world and all you're doing is looking to adopt best practice, it just means you're going second everything you choose to do, right? Someone else has gone first. They decided it was best practice. You're now following best practice, right? And I would say we have positionally strived to be number 2 in the world everywhere, right? And that's a mindset change, because there's actually 2 more steps beyond best practice, right? The next step is that you're an innovator, right? That's where you're taking best practice and saying, you know what, I think we could do better than best practice, right? We're going to take the risk and we're going to go 1 step further, but it's an incremental step. And then you have the researchers and the players who are being the explorers, right? And I would say we have funded our universities to be explorers, but we have adopted a system that wants to be best practice, right? And there's a big gap between being an explorer and being best practice. And in order for us to move things into the system, we actually have to decide as a system that best practice is not good enough. And that if someone is going to lead, why not us? And that's a big shift. That is not who we have been, right? And that comes to how you buy capital, right? When you're going to buy technology, are you going around and visiting all the sites that have used that capital already and de-risked that decision for you? Or are you working with the vendors about the capital that's going to be in the technology that's coming out 2 years from now, and you're volunteering to go first to prove that it can be done, right? So think about your own environment that you work in. You decide where you fall in that spectrum, but if we ever want to see the movement and the translation, right, from exploring into clinical practice, we have to decide that our system needs to play up front. And that's not a decision that we've made in the past.
Very interesting, very interesting. Questions from the audience? Raise your hand. And I know a lot of names, so I can pick somebody out. Yes. Right here.
Thank you. That was excellent conversation. I'm curious to know. Mostly, I just wanted to do my job for me and answer the questions. So we talk a lot about risk aversion. I'm the current acting director for our Innovation Evidence Impact team, Justin and Mark. We know that there's risk aversion. Where we struggle is making that go away. So I'm curious to know if you've had any successes or strategies that have been able to mitigate that risk aversion.
So thanks for that question, because I'm the person who will say every meeting we hosted after like the 6-month mark, I don't want to hear any more about the problems. Like really, I think I can articulate every single problem with this issue. It just manifests itself differently depending on the company. So let's talk about solutions. That's a great question. I think that on the capability issue, someone has to get their arms around this. And I'm not making any comments about individuals with whom I've worked or otherwise, but from an organizational perspective, whether it's the Ministry of Health or the hospitals or again, maybe the AHS, I don't know. But people really have to get their heads around that, because you're only, like you can't ask people to do things that they're not good at. That's the whole reason that to execute a strategy, you get the right skills and get those in place. That's one. Two, though, if we had another year in the role, we were going to tackle that challenge of replicating competition in the publicly funded system. So again, please, I'm not advocating private sector delivery. It's a different conversation. But in the private world, so if if you're down at the Cleveland Clinic, although it's not for profit, the reality is they have to improve their patient offering at the same or lower price point, or they will die in some form. And so you innovate. We need to figure out how to do that in our health systems. So there are different ways you can do that. And one of the things we're thinking about is, first of all, maybe you do introduce a private component somewhere, and they do exist. So you got the Shouldice Clinic in Ontario that's doing hernia surgeries. I mean, who was the big U.S. anti-Canadian healthcare politician? Rand Paul. Guess where he was having his hernia surgery done? He came up here to get it. So I think there are places where you can do it. But then the challenge in driving behavioral change, which is what we're talking about, is the hardest kind of change, is you need to celebrate the successes. So we need, the champions in place, we need the capabilities in place, we need then the examples and the success stories, and we need to talk about them and put the pressure on those who aren't leading to at least aim for best practice. But the next thing I'll say is, ultimately what you have to have is the incentive lined up to the objectives. Because really, we're just one step removed from animals. So we will respond to external stimuli and act accordingly. And this doesn't mean more money. I really don't believe that money is not going to be the answer to the demographic surge that we're facing. But money is also not needed to just get more innovation. Well, what you could do, for example, is ensure that, say, hospitals or whoever the health service provider is keeps their surplus. So now, right away, and the condition could be you can keep your surplus, but you have to reinvest in, and maybe you define it as innovation. Define innovation in some way. So you're not putting more money in the system, but you're saying, you know what, if you men and women who are super smart out there can find a way to do the same or better with less, you can keep that, and you can put it back into the practice of medicine, which will drive up patient outcomes. There are also, I don't know enough about the Alberta funding formulas, but one of the biggest challenges in Ontario was hospitals were funded based on the anticipated cost of care. So you had an average cost per care. And again, belaboring it, generally investment in innovation requires an upfront investment that pays off over time. So if you're doing something based on a formula, based on an average, if you invest up front, now you're offside. And so they actually were, it's not only wasn't an incentive to adopt and scale innovation, it was actually a disincentive. So if you look at the systems if you're looking to answer the question, are the incentives aligned to the subjective of having higher risk tolerance to adopt and scale to improve patient outcomes and optimize investment in health innovation, and getting people to find reasons how, ways how to do things and reasons to say yes, as opposed to it just being comfortable to say no, that's the type of behavioral change you need to get to.
Great question. I think part of what I talk about is what we see, at least, or what I saw, in terms of trying to adopt. We became this land of pilots. We love doing pilots. There's so many pilots. It was sort of that middle stage of, we're going to try this pilot, and if it works or if it doesn't work, we'll do it on a much smaller scale. And ultimately, usually what happened was there wasn't either, the pilot wasn't powered enough. It wasn't, you didn't get you couldn't get a positive or negative answer, in a straight way, one way or another, and then everything died, and it sort of, it never went anywhere. What I noticed with, some of the funding in that program that I talked about earlier between AI and AHS, to try to drive, some real world evidence within the system to help make a procurement decision was, let's think about that process all the way to the end. Let's make sure that we are properly powering our studies, so that, we actually get a real yes/no answer that will help make a procurement decision at the end of that. Because if you don't do that, you end up getting lost. We see that, I see that all the time with startup companies who don't go all the way. They're so afraid, I think, to make a decision that will kill the company because they're so invested in it. They'd rather do a half trial, right? They'll do enough. Just I have this much money. I'm going to do 3 patients, and that's going to give me an indication one way or another as to whether or not I should continue or not. But I have to start my trial all over again because it's a new study and a new trial and a new design. Instead of actually just doing the trial that's going to make the difference of whether or not it's yes or no. I see that happen all the time, and it's sort of that investment and that concern around risk.
Maybe add one comment in. I think it's really just, you need to build courage in the organization, right? Everyone's been told to not take risks, right? And risks have always been very little reward for taking it in our system. And so how do you rebuild courage right at the front line? And I'll just give you a practical example from my own organization. One of the challenges, we have a facilities team. We design our spaces. We do all those layouts, all those kinds of things. And then they stay like that for the next 15 years unless you go through the process of trying to find someone to move that wall plug or take that code. It would be great if we had didn't have shelves here, right? And that, I don't know why that's a challenge in every organization is facilities. So one of the things we did when we renovated our space is, instead of having any fixed piece of furniture, there was no such thing anymore as fixed furniture. All we did was we bought a whole bunch of aluminum tables that were super light that anyone could pick up and move, and they came in like 8 different sizes, and we gave our staff the flexibility and the key to a storeroom that had a whole bunch of them in it, and you design your own space, and when you need your space to change, you just take the table you don't want, you go put it in that room, and you bring out the table you do want. Right? And so, just empowering people to change their physical environment is a great way to build courage, right? In terms of just change. And I think, often we need to deregulate change. And I know that sounds crazy, but we have created all these massive processes to manage change. We just need to ditch that and let people change. What's the worst case scenario if they make a mistake, right? And that's where we need to build comfort, right? It's a courage issue, and I think it starts with giving everyone little wins. And I love the idea, if you save money, then whether it's all or a portion of it goes back into doing something you want to do. So you do something for me, and if it works well and there's a return, then I let you do something for you, and I'm not going to judge what that is. If you think everyone needs 2 monitors, fine, right? But the point is, you're in control, you're empowered. So I think it's about empowering and providing courage for ourselves.
Great, thank you. So the courage to be able to make a mistake. We only have time for one more question. Bill Chung. The mic is running to you.
Thanks. I'm very pleased to hear that Alberta already has what other people desire. Now, if we are going to brag, what's the most significant thing about our system that we can brag about. And also being innovative, what is next for Alberta? Thanks.
So briefly.
But I think we need to send a we have started the conversation with the rest of Canada, even internationally. We have lots of people who we have gathered their attention. Ultimately, we need to execute on something that makes it very clear that Alberta is open for business, and business is not a bad word in health, right? And so, I'm looking at Justin, because I do think probably one of our most differentiated opportunities is our data. And we need to, I think that is probably the most internationally and probably the biggest signal we could give is to do something with our data that makes it very clear we are open for business. And I think that's a great opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, the question often comes up, so how are you differentiated, right? What is your sustaining competitive advantage within this marketplace versus California or Boston or any other jurisdiction that wants to do more within the health arena? And I would say, the easy ones are data and the quality of the institutions. Although both of those are very challenging in themselves, right? There are large, corporations, institutions within the U.S. that have very, very large sets of data. It doesn't get shared, hopefully, the same way. But it's still, in terms of a competitive advantage and where we have large assets that are relatively unique, it's still that, and I think the quality of our universities and research. Okay, thank you.
A quick one from the outsider's perspective. I think probably the biggest asset you have is your health system as test bed, because for all the reasons everyone's articulated, it is centralized. You've got really strong people here, and a desire to do things differently. So that notion of using Alberta as a test bed for companies looking to have a publicly funded system as opposed to the privately funded one, which is what most of the world has, would be really, really powerful. We were kind of getting there in Ontario. We couldn't get there. It's too fragmented. You have that advantage. And let me give you an example. So Apple is now in 250 hospitals in the US. This is like in the last 3 months, they've gone from 30 to 250 people. So while we in Canada navel gaze on how are we going to deal with privacy and we're worried about protecting this publicly funded health system, irony is an overused word. This is actually ironic. People are taking steps seeking to protect the publicly funded system, and by doing so, they're being overcautious and are going to have the perverse result of gutting it. Because while we're navel gazing on privacy, consumers, patients are happy to have Apple, which is not a data company, use it to improve patient outcomes, and they're signing up in droves. So that data play combined with Alberta as a test bed, and go with a sexy company like Apple. I think the data on Google and Amazon and Facebook is a different question, but on Apple, it's pretty solid. And you could do something like that. You really could. And Ontario is not going to be able to. It's going to be like a Saskatchewan or New Brunswick or somebody that's going to do it first because they're smaller. But you guys, you could do that. And I think that would be amazing.
Well, that's terrific. So lots of great thoughts, including being a little bit more open to taking risks, both individually and organizationally and culturally, and certainly a lot of benefits in our infrastructure, in our organizations. So we should collectively be doing better. That's terrific. Before I thank our panel, just a few announcements. I want to thank our student ambassadors. Where are our student ambassadors? Thank you very much. Great job. Happy to announce 2 upcoming events or talks. Our 2019 Canadian Business Leader Award dinner, CBLA, will honor Steve Williams, the CEO of Suncor, on April 3rd, 2019 at the Edmonton Conference Centre. It'll be a great event celebrating one of Alberta and Canada's great leaders. I hope to see many of you there. And the next Eric Geddes Luncheon will be on April 18th, right here at the Matrix, and the topic is cannabis and the retail market 6 months later. We had a talk on cannabis and cannabis markets in the fall. 6 months later, where are we? What's happening? Where are we going? What are the opportunities, risks, and so on? It should be a great
We need a bigger room.
Better aeration. With that, We had a great panel today. Bill, Jason Ding, Jason Pinnock, thank you very much for being here with us. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our great panelists.